What is up, guys? Lord Nick here, bringing you another One Piece related video. This is like the 18th time I've made this video, but in case you guys are new here, feel free to check out the Discord, guys. We have a Becca chord that is kind of turned into a Dressrosa chord. It's down below in the description. Totally didn't forget to do that the last remake that I did of this. This is not, hey, Hooch, this isn't video number 8, and I totally didn't just remember this time to do it. Anyhow, OP08 lists for Rebecca, guys. It's that time again. We are deep into the OP08 meta. A lot of folks are starting to ask again, what do we build? How do we play? What do we do? Blah, 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 blah. I have an FAQ kind of discussing some of the basics behind some of the stuff, but this is going into deck lists, guys. This is to give you ideas of deck lists. These are giving you the concepts that I'm playing with or concepts that are being played with in the East. Now, note, we don't really have any Eastern Rebecca players from OP08 meta that I could really show off. And the one real big showing for a tournament that I could pull up from the OPTCG deck lists is going to be, or top deck list or whatever it's called, is going to be a 3v3s tournament. And there's a lot of issues with that in terms of trying to be like, oh, this is a great deck. And the big parts of that is, one, we don't know what the Rebecca's personal record was because their teammates could have just carried them and they could have lost all 5. Probably didn't happen, but, you know, reasonably they went 3-2 with Rebecca, because at some point they had to hit a bad matchup, I imagine. But 2, it was also at the very beginning of the OP09 meta, and the problem with that is that at the very beginning of a meta, a lot of things are in flux. People are trying to figure out the meta. People are trying to figure out what they want to play, how they're going to play it, and there's going to be a lot of testing with not what are either new decks or decks that were not meta before. And people that are playing Rebecca generally have been playing Rebecca for a while. So that means they have an edge in the fact that they know what their deck does. They may not know what your deck does, but they know what their deck does. And if you don't, then they have at least that much advantage on you, and you have a chance to make more misplays than they're going to probably make. So Rebecca generally does better at the beginning of every format, more so than later on into the formats where she has to actually start playing into meta decks and stuff that is becoming more solved. We're kind of at that point where stuff's getting solved, but I chose a OP09 list from this YouTuber. I'll post the list down below with all my other lists. If you want to check out this YouTuber, just look up OP09 Rebecca. It probably brings up my video, but that video has a link to this YouTuber, so you can watch some of the videos they've done with Rebecca. Their general route is going a Gecko Moria route with some top-end removal pieces like Stussy and Red Rock. They also have the one of Trudeau, which I think is fine. It's a good option for dealing with top-end again. And then they also just kind of run a general core of what you see in a Rebecca list. Now, their build is much more focused on self-mill and heavy combo build. So you're comboing with the Geckos, with the one-drop events, with your Olumbuses, with everything. Everything about this is a combo list, but it is also very much focused on self-milling and getting to the point that you have 0 cards in deck and then using Luffy to put cards back into your deck in a specific order so you know what cards are coming, so you can play for that. And it's trying to do this as fast as possible while also controlling your opponent's board. So there's a lot of ways you can mess this up and muck this up, but on top of that, they're running 10 2Ks, and the premise here is that you're putting as many 2Ks into your hand and then pitching them away, counter out, trying to stay at 5 life as long as you can while removing your opponent's board. I think this is a very difficult way to play the game, very difficult way to play Rebecca. It is not a bad way to play Rebecca, but for people that are newer and people that are trying to learn Rebecca, this is actually a very difficult thing to learn. Ultimately, I would say if you are a veteran to Rebecca, the Eastern style of playing her is much more focused around the veterans, and you could definitely do this, but I think that there are some slightly better ways of doing it, just due to the fact that there's a slightly easier route of playing even just a Gecko Moria list that is still heavy combo focused, but not necessarily as much on the self-mill and trying to perfect play the Rebecca. Though if you can get to the point of playing this deck as perfectly as possible, this deck has a lot of potential to be almost any matchup due to the fact that it has an answer for basically every matchup. But that's kind of the Eastern route is, you know, make yourself as good as you can with a list that has as many options as you can and kind of play it that route, and then play it the traditional way of self-milling. Note, they do not have a Kong gun. They kind of agree with my side, from based off of what I've watched, they've kind of agreed with the idea that Kong gun is not a necessary win condition. It is a very telegraph combo win condition that you could play for, but has a lot of ways around it with the fact that blockers can get in the way. This deck is focused more on removing those things and then just beating your opponent down with big bodies in the end and giving them no real breathing room to play. So this kind of falls into almost like a fatigue control style that is also using heavy combo and self-mill as its routes of getting to that fatigue control. Meanwhile, whoops, wrong way. Meanwhile, when you look at my Gecko build, the way that I've kind of built Gecko for is a lot more of a mid-game kind of tempo strategy. And when we're talking about the Western philosophy, I've kind of helped design the idea of the two styles of Rebecca. And other folks have gone off and made this even more prevalent than me to a degree, right? I think that there is a tempo style that is more of a mid-range kind of control style that is heavy combo oriented, or you go into a fatigue style that is also relatively heavy combo sometimes, but is much more about grinding out your opponent, whereas the mid-range one is, I get your stuff out of the way, start smacking you hard in the face, and you need to answer now, or I'm going to just take over the game because I have big resources here, and I've done well to control you enough that my resources are now taking over. Whereas my other one is, I'm just controlling you. You have no resources. You have no way of playing out of it, and we're going to win. So when we're looking at this list, what is the tempo aspect of this? Well, the aspect of that is that the fact that we have Houndblaze for early game removal, we have Leo for early game removal, we have Hina's for comboing with those pieces, Kyros is for developing early game removal and such. If you draw your Scarlet to play a Kyros out, that's pretty good early game as well. You have Brooks, one-legged soldiers. We have so many removal pieces and options and tech pieces. But the general route is everything is somewhat low to the ground, and we're comboing these things out. And then once we get to late game, we're playing our Gecko Morias to play out these things again. And then Luffy's going to be putting this stuff back. Moncherie going to be there as an option card to get us these cards throughout the game so that we don't have to focus around turbo self-milling ourselves and then remembering how we're stacking our deck to find the cards we need. We can use Moncherie to get some of the big cards that we need back to us. I think she's an underutilized tool both on the Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy outside of my own lists due to the fact that I think that she adds in so many things. On top of that, if you get to a point in the late game where your opponent has a better board than you and you're trying to fish out some options, you can utilize her once she's already developed. You can do her one Dawn ability, rest her, get back a Rebecca, play the Rebecca, grab back a Sabo, then play the Sabo, and now you're fixing your hand as well as making an unkillable board that has 2 blockers on it. You could also utilize her once you already have like a Gecko and an Aramaki out or a Luffy and an Aramaki out. You can use that type of combo from a Moncherie to maintain having 2 blockers up while you're smacking face with the Luffy and the Aramaki and just making it all around a big nuisance for your opponent to deal with. Ultimately, I think these are very good options. One of the big things that I did take away from the Western philosophy outside of utilizing most of the same list is actually utilizing the Red Rocks. I think Red Rocks have become more prevalent in OP08. And the reason these are coming back as a prevalence for OP08 is due to the fact that we are seeing a lot more Jacks. And Jack is a card that we really need to be able to deal with. Having a 2 of tech specifically for Jack is very good. And a lot of people might question, well, why do we have a 2 of tech? Why are we teching so heavily for a card and it's only 2 of? Well, we know we're going to run into Lucci's. We know that that's going to happen. It's almost an inevitability when he's about 20% of the meta, probably, maybe close to 25 to 30, depending on where you're playing. So you need a tech for him. You have to have an option for him. And ultimately, you can't be like, oh, well, I have so many combo pieces and so much reduction pieces that I could just easily remove an 11. Well, okay, cool. You use all of those to remove him. What do you have for everything else? Well, you don't. So having 1 card that can deal with him is better than having to use like 4 cards to deal with him. On top of that, it bottom decks, so that's why I value it over a Stussy, for instance. Bottom decking a Jack makes it harder for them to be able to utilize their Jack. But ultimately, that's kind of the big answers there. For this deck, that's the big thing I took away from their list that needed to be added to this list, was I think that they got it right on the fact that Gum Gum Red Rock needs to come back into pretty much every Rebecca list now because of how prevalent Jack is. It's also not a dead card into our good matchups. Into Bonnies and Anels, it actually helps with those. And as we get closer to the OP09 meta, pretty much everybody's going to be running some type of 10 drop as their boss end. So having a card that just deals with it as opposed to having to combo out all these pieces to figure out how to deal with it in multiple 10s or ups in a row just helps in those matchups. It makes them a little cleaner. That is a local focus list that is very combo heavy. I didn't actually get into some of the combos, but let's actually get into those real quick before we move to the next list, actually. So Gecko Moria can come out to grab you a Rebecca and a Scarlet from your trash. What that then does is Rebecca grabs you a Hina to your hand. Rebecca then deploys the Hina to -4 one of their characters. You then use Scarlet's ability, -2 that same character, and deploy either a Leo or Kyros from your hand. And now you can KO a 7-cost or less with just those cards alone. On top of that, that is then a giant Dawn swing. I don't really care about the Dawn efficiency of it. I care about the stats. Well, the stats that we're getting is an 8-drop 9k, a 4-drop 0 who is a blocker who is active and ready to go, a 3-drop 5k, and a 3-drop 5k. That is hard to remove. So we now have two 5k attackers, a 9k attacker, and a 0k blocker. All because of 8 Dawn, and we've removed a 7 cost from their board. So ultimately, this is a very solid combo piece. Now, some of the other combos that we could do, I already kind of talked about. Moncherie into Rebecca into Sabo to keep our board state from diminishing and being very nuisancey. It's a really good way to make sure that our board state, once we have a big one, kind of settles out and carries the game. Meanwhile, we could utilize stuff like Brook plus Scarlet and One-Legged Soldier to be able to remove something as big of a 6-drop because of the fact that Scarlet can play. You can tap Scarlet, play out the One-Legged Soldier, then KO the One-Legged Soldier to his own ability, both of which are then reducing by 2 and then 3, and then Brook swings, reduces by another 1, so anything 6 and below is now killed by Brook using those 3 cards. You could also utilize this with a Hound Blaze if you wanted to, so you could do Scarlet, reduce a 3 cost by 2, and then One-Legged Soldier, reduce a 5 cost by 3. Hound Blaze, buff your Brook, remove the 3 cost that's now the 5 cost that's now a 2 cost, and then swing with the Brook and KO the 3. So you've now efficiently, with 3 cards, of course, this is kind of a weird combo, but it is a combo that can be done. So as you've already seen, that's 3 combos. Now, one of the other combos that you can be doing here is going to be with a Luffy that you've already developed that has not swung twice, so he's restood. You can then utilize something like Orlumbus, KO the Kyros, keep Kyros alive by resting your stage. Use a Hound Blaze to buff the Luffy. You then remove the 6-drop or less with that Hound Blaze, buffing your Luffy to a 10. You can swing 10 into either your opponent's life or 10 into one of their board state characters, be maybe a Jack. Or you can stack a couple extra Dawn on there to guarantee the fact that you're going to kill this Jack. If they, some reason, pitch their hand to keep him alive, guess what? You restand Luffy, swing in there, and kill it anyways. Or you clear 2 characters, or you do 2 swings into life. There's ultimately so many different things that you can do with this list. I think it's a very solid list. That being said, I think that its ability to deal with late-game decks is a little bit less strong and easy to pull off than my own Kuzan list. I very much actually enjoy my Kuzan list. Note, I've moved to having Hound Blazes in this list. I used to run a lot of Gravity Blades, and in the next list, you might see Gravity Blades coming back. The biggest reason I've moved to this is the fact that I've seen a giant number of Zeros here in my local meta. So because of this, I've added in Hound Blazes to deal with that. That being said, Hound Blaze is also a great option for dealing with stuff like Dofi, as it gives us the ability to attack one of his rested characters with better attack on our side. On top of that, removing another one of his characters and bottom decking it, so he can't even get it back with like a Gecko play. 4-drop Gecko, by the way. 4-drop Gecko adds 1 back to their hand. So, we bottom the Jinbei, KO one of the other characters. Pretty solid play. Ultimately, the list is very similar to the Gecko list. It doesn't utilize Gecko to get stuff back. Instead, we are relying on the Aramaki Kuzan combo, which is a very big lockout on turn 10. And the way that generally works is you can set up an Orlumbus with something before you play the Aramaki. If Orlumbus makes it to your 8 Dawn turn, you play Aramaki, remove a 6. Then on the following turn, because Aramaki's probably living, there's, outside of like Lucci, not many decks are removing him. He sticks around, and then you drop a Kuzan, remove a 5, use Aramaki to remove a 7. If Orlumbus is for some reason still around, you can reduce something by 4 to Kuzan away a 9 and get rid of a 7, or whichever way you need to do it. Ultimately, these 2 cards then kill 2 things, and for every turn after that, your Aramaki can remove basically everything from the game, with just a little bit of assistance there. So ultimately, it becomes a very big lockout, and then any cards you draw after that are removals because of Kuzan just become that much stronger and that much better. Ultimately, it's just a very difficult deck once you get to beat once you get to that lockout combo. If you can't get to that lockout combo, though, yeah, it struggles a little bit, but it still has almost every one of the pieces that the previous list had. The biggest difference here is we've dropped 1 Luffy and the Scarlet. And the reason we dropped down 1 Luffy is I don't think we really need 3 Luffys, and having 2 extra 2Ks in the case of this helps this deck have a little bit more consistency of surviving the early game, get to the mid game, and then power through into the late game. This is a starvation style of deck, or fatigue for those that are more familiar with it. This is a very late game focused deck. The whole premise of this is not to worry, not to fret. We are gonna win late. This is kind of the mantra of every League of Legends player out there. Hey, don't worry, guys. We're scale. Like, that's basically what this deck is. We are a scaling deck. We are playing for late. We are trying to get to late. We have some of the same combos that are available in the Gecko, just not in the same way that the Gecko does it, right? We can Rebecca to get back a Hina, play the Hina with the Rebecca, then play a Kyros out of hand. Kyros then swings into a character, which is pretty nice. We don't have a Gecko on board, but that's still a pretty solid removal. Ultimately, we did drop the events to keep the Hinas in. You could look to add 1-drop events if you think that that's more beneficial. I felt like having a body is more beneficial in the current meta state, just due to the fact that having more things that your opponent then has to remove makes it harder for them to make removal-based decisions. And ultimately, it helps us somewhat with those decks. So, what did I think is this competitive list? Do I think any of my other lists are competitive? Well, I think my Kuzan list is actually the best competitive list we have. Ultimately, though, one change that I will make, and this is in preparation for 8.5, is moving the Houndblazes away and going back into Gravity Blades. The reason we go back into the Gravity Blades, though, is just because it helps us with all three of the Luffy matchups. That is Black Yellow Luffy, Starter Deck 14 Luffy, and Pluffy. All of these decks are going to be very strong into the 8.5 meta, and all of these decks are decks that we need to be able to have answers for. Houndblaze is really much more into it's pretty solid into Dofi, and it's very good into Zuro. And Zuro kind of falls off into this. Dofi does get better, but Gravity Blade actually still helps us with it. The biggest thing here is that we are banking much more on having a Hina Leo in our hand, or Hina Kiros early, or Hina Brook early, to be able to deal with stuff that Dofi is playing out. We're also hoping that Dofis are much more onto the just kind of flood the board strat, opposed to any of the like strats that run a decent number of removal. Hope that they only really have red rocks, and that makes it very hard for them to answer our board state, in which that we can keep playing characters and start answering theirs, and we actually have an okay matchup into them. As for the Lucci matchup, which is probably the matchup most of you are curious about, most of you want to know what are our answers for it, well, our biggest answer is Red Rock. Red Rock helps us get rid of the Jax, which is probably one of the more problematic cards that they have, because almost everything else we can actually deal with relatively well. Once we've developed a Kuzan, they have to blow a decent chunk of resources if they don't have a Jack to deal with the Kuzan, or they have to play an Ice Age into another Jack to get rid of the Kuzan. And if we keep bottom decking their Jacks, it's very rough for them. And ultimately, I believe in our ability to drop a Kuzan and have it live, opposed to their ability to drop a Jack and have it live, if we are playing for the Red Rocks at least. The goal of this deck into that is going to be starve the Lucci out, try not to swing at his life, keep him from getting cards that way, because that's really the only way he gains cards. So don't swing at his life until you've starved him out as much as you can out of his hand and out of his field. You could take early damage from him, but try to develop some blockers, try to play for putting up some blocker stuff. And like I said, with the Hinas, we have multiple extra threats that he now has to answer. And because they're adding Jacks in, they're actually cutting 6-cost Brooks, which means our Kiroses are almost guaranteed to stick on the board, which means we don't need to develop the Orlumbus first now. We could develop a Kiros first, and he's probably not going away, because they almost have no way of dealing with him multiple times in a turn, you know. And if they want to use 3 KO abilities to deal with him in one turn, that's pretty good for us, actually. That's ultimately very strong for us. But if we could develop Kiros into an Orlumbus, we can do something like Orlumbus into, say, a Rebecca to deploy a Hina into a Leo, right? Like, we could get rid of a 9-cost that way. That's pretty good. I don't think we need to do something like that ridiculous. Like I said, outside of the Jacks and the Geckos, there's nothing else that big. So the cards that we want to bottom deck are going to be Jacks. The things that we want to kill are going to be the Geckos, because they can get back the Jacks with Rebecca's. They can't get the Geckos back. So to get the Geckos back, they have to bottom deck the Geckos. They have to then find the Geckos. They have to play the Jacks. And by that point, we should already have a controlling enough board state to win, because they're running out of resources to do anything with. Other cards that you really want to bottom deck are going to be there are 3 copies of Spandine, and that's because Spandine is what allows them to get Lucci's back with Geckos. If we bottom deck those guys and don't let them get KO'd, then we're in a good spot, because then their combo becomes weaker, right? They can Gecko to get Rebecca to put a Lucci back into their hand, but they don't really have anything that comes back other than Lucci to KO stuff. So if they don't have any Spandines to do that with, their Gecko plays get much worse too. Or they have to Gecko into the Luccis and they don't get the Rebeccas, which means they don't have any blockers, which at that point in the game, if they're removing some of our smaller stuff, that's fine, because then, well, guess what? We have big boys that are just going to come in and kill them. So really, it's going to be try to starve them out, try to play it long. I mean, ultimately, this list is trying to play it long no matter who you're against, but it is very good at playing it long into the likes of Bonnie, Pudding, Enel, Kata. Those are the decks that it's just like, okay, we take some early damage from you, but your closing power is really more focused on if we don't have ways of removing your board, and we have a lot of ways of dealing with and removing their board. Same thing kind of go with the Luffy's a bit. Though Black Yellow Luffy kind of injures himself a lot, so all you really have to do is get rid of his Sabos. That's why we really want the Gravity Blades back in, is because it deals with the Sabos. With the Pluffy, he does injure himself quite a bit as well, and the biggest thing there is that he's playing a lot of cards that can get removed by them, and if he's playing anything like Magellan's again, then hey, Gravity Blades are a really great answer for that. And that about does it, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like down below, leave a comment down below, let me know what you'd like to see. And I'll remind you once more to join the Discord that is down below. It is filled with more than just Rebecca. It is a whole Dressrosa cord. So feel free to join in and have fun, guys. And until the next time, I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day. Bye, guys.